Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein, and you know what? This could be a bit of a landmark show today. We're approaching 500 followers on Twitter, and we're hoping this episode gets us past that number. And we're optimistic, because if you thought last week's episode was jam-packed, this one is like insane. It's bursting at the seams, because we've gone all out, as we do every week. You know, half measures, not really our thing. But we've done the legwork, crunched the numbers, and examined not just all 27 championship teams. That would be way too easy. We examined every single season in franchise history to settle it once and for all. What are the 5 greatest Yankee seasons of all time? And I came up with some fascinating results, and we'll have it all for you here on Bronx Bombers. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, rate and review us, share it with as many people as you possibly can. You know, the most common reaction we get to our show each week, especially from people that are just hearing it for the first time, is, man, what you guys are doing here, it's really cool. More people need to hear this. Well, you know what? We agree. More people need to hear this, and for a mom and pop store like this, you're the best way to make that happen. So help us spread the word. You can follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well, or if you want to drop us a note, send your comments and questions to joe@BronxBombersPodcast.com. However you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you, and we really do. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results on a controversial proposal from Major League Baseball that's made some headlines, the 20-second pitch clock. We'll get into that, your views and mine. Also, EJ Fagan of the Bronx Beat podcast will be with us again for part 2 of our conversation as we talk Gary Sanchez, starting rotation, prospects, Jacoby Ellsbury, all that and more. And I'll answer an important question from one of our followers on Chad Green and his role on our staff. But first, let's get you caught up on the latest headlines with Mike Moreno. Mike, what do you got?
Well, the big story so far this offseason has been the slow pace of the free agent market. With spring training only a week away, over 100 players remain unsigned, including many top free agents. The situation has even led to rumors of a player boycott of spring training, but on Sunday, the Major League Baseball Players Association refuted this, stating, quote, "Recent press reports have erroneously suggested that the Players Association has threatened a boycott of spring training. Those reports are false. No such threat has been made, nor has the union recommended such a course of action," unquote. However, Jeff Passan of Yahoo Sports reports that players have discussed not showing up to camp until the mandatory date of February 24th, roughly a week later than usual. So, at least for now, the stalemate continues, as does the logjam of unsigned free agents. And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
You know, one of the great things about being a Yankee fan is we have this incredible history. And there's so many great teams over the years that it's become kind of a common exercise to compare and contrast all these great seasons and try to decide once and for all which is best. But today I decided to expand the field a bit and rank the top 5 Yankee seasons of all time. So in this podcast, we'll take a look at 5, 4, and 3 in that order. And then next week, I'll reveal the number 1 team and the runner-up. Now, something I've always noticed that's interesting about fans that grew up in a certain championship era is that they're often convinced that their team, you know, the team that won it all when they were in their impressionable years, that team is the best of all time, that no team could be better. Throw stats out the window. They just know on some intuitive level that no other team could possibly match up. And as I said, not everyone does that, but a lot of people do. And I get it. I mean, seeing is believing. But today, I'm going to gather all those stats that got thrown out the window and put them all to use as we decide who ranks where. So using managers to define these eras, there was the Miller-Huggins era from 1918 to 1929, which included that powerhouse 27 team, which many believe is the greatest of all time. We'll see if that belief holds up to scrutiny. Then there was the Joe McCarthy era from 1931 to 1946. So there we saw the transition from the Ruth Gehrig teams to the DiMaggio teams. And then the Casey Stengel years, where his team was the only one in Major League history to win 5 titles in a row. And then there was the Ralph Houck era, which, you know, the first Ralph Houck era, which only lasted 3 years. He was replaced after the Yankees got swept in the World Series in 1963. That was the first time the Yankees were ever swept, by the way, in the World Series. But then actually Houck returned in 1966 and managed some of the absolute worst teams in franchise history. That first season he came back, which ended with the Yankees' 26 6.5 games out of first place. This is a couple years after CBS bought the team, and they were kind of absentee owners. But get this, there was one game in September of 1966 where the total attendance was 413, 413. That's it, in the stands at Yankee Stadium. And Red Barber, who was doing Yankee telecasts then, he told the cameramen to pan the empty seats because, these guys are kind of reporters in a way. So he wanted to document it. But, even though the cameramen were ordered to refuse that request by Red Barber and did so, word got around and Red Barber was fired a week later. And then 2 years later in 68, now bear in mind, this was a pitcher's era for sure. The mound was 15 inches high and averages were just plummeting. I mean, you had Carl Yastrzemski winning the batting title in 1967, hitting 301, okay? But the Yankees in 1968 batted 214 as a team. 214, whole team hitting like pitchers. And that's the lowest season batting average ever in the live ball era. But as I did the research for this segment, I found something really fascinating, which is that some of the greatest Yankee teams by regular season winning percentage did not end in championships. And we had at least 16 regular seasons by my count that were every bit as good, if not better, than a number of our championship seasons. And certainly, if there had been a tiered playoff system prior to 1969, I think the Yankees would have at least 6 or 7 or more championship notches on their belt. So before we move on, I want to give a shout out to a few of those great non-title clubs. So first of all, in recent history, 2 of them were 2003 and 2004, identical win percentage both seasons at .623, which is actually better than the following championship clubs in reverse order here: 2000, 99, 96, so all but one of Torrey's championship teams, both with the Billy Martin / Don Lemon teams in 77 and 78, the 62, 58, and 52 championship clubs. 2003 and 4 were better than all of those seasons I just mentioned. And in case you're wondering, the 2000 championship club of the Subway Series that year had the lowest winning percentage of all 27 Yankee championship clubs at .540, so 22 points lower than our win percentage last season. But the fact remains, a low percentage does not preclude a championship as long as you get in there, and a high percentage guarantees you exactly nothing. Now, for my analysis, I used percentage stats much more than cumulative stats. Why? Because they gave a more complete picture. For example, just saying Rickey Henderson stole the most bases in Major League history, which is a cumulative stat, that's not enough information. It's only half the story. If we're interested, in Henderson's value to the teams for which he played, and this is really the appeal of advanced metrics and why I'm a believer, they're simply better at assessing actual player value and therefore team value. And there's no question in my mind that the rise of advanced metrics helped another great base stealer, Tim Raines, ex-Yankee, enter the Hall of Fame a few years ago on his 10th and final try, because when you compare Tim Raines and Rickey Henderson, what you discover is that Raines was the better percentage base stealer. See, what that cumulative stat for Rickey Henderson, 1,406 total stolen bases, does not tell you is how many times he was thrown out. It's kind of relevant, wouldn't you say? And when you factor that in, Tim Raines was the better percentage base stealer with an 84.7% success rate compared to Rickey's 80.7. I mean, if you look back at Rickey's career and assess it honestly, a great base stealer, of course. But let's face it, he was reckless a lot of the time. For example, he tried to steal third base way too often. He got thrown out there a lot. And of course, by going so many times, he padded his stats and will certainly remain the quote-unquote stolen base king for all time, because stealing is way down in the majors precisely because of the risk involved. So good for him, I guess. But Tim Raines was the better stealer, the more efficient base stealer, and we learned that from percentage statistics. And just to put it into perspective, how much more efficient, Rickey Henderson would have to return to baseball and steal 448 consecutive bases without being caught to pass Tim Raines in stolen base efficiency. But getting back to the Yankees, looking back at that 98 season, for example, which was incredible and something to behold for those who were lucky enough to see it, the Yankees won a franchise record 114 games that year, but was that the Yankees' best regular season? Remember, percentage stats. So looking back at that 1927 team, first of all, they won just 4 fewer games in a season that was 8 games shorter. And secondly, they lost 4 fewer games. So they had a win percentage of 714 compared to 704 for the 98 club. But I do think that non-title seasons have been sort of lost in the shuffle historically, given all of our championship teams. And the two best were the 1942 Yankees, first of all, who won 103 games that season, but lost in 5 to the Cardinals in the World Series. That 42 staff was led by a couple of pitchers you may not have heard of, both really good, Tiny Bonham and Spud Chandler. Tiny was actually a joke nickname. He was well over 6 feet, so that would be like calling Aaron Judge tiny, or like calling Jose Altuve, all 5'6" of him, I don't know, Jumbo or something. But Tiny Bonham in 1942 won 21 games that year, which led the American League. And the year prior, he won the decisive Game 5 of the 41 World Series, throwing a complete Game 4 hitter against the Dodgers. That was a series, of course, where the Dodgers had the Yankees absolutely dead to rights in Game 4 at Ebbets Field. Yankees down 1 run with 2 outs in the 9th. Tommy Henrich swings and misses at strike 3, series tied, right? Wrong. Mickey Owen, catcher for the Dodgers, misses the ball, which goes to the backstop. Henrich makes it to first. Yankees pour on 4 runs, and the rest is history. Just a devastating gut punch for the Dodgers that year, from which they never recovered. And ironically, Mickey Owen was actually a really great fielding catcher. In fact, that 41 season, he set a record at the time for the most consecutive fielding chances without an error by a catcher. But one doozy on that big stage there, and there goes your reputation, right? But, there were some Mickey Owen defenders who said it should have been ruled a wild pitch, but, what's the difference, right? The Yankees would have still won. But Owen himself, to his credit, said that although not a strike, it was a low inside curve that he definitely should have handled. And the 54 Yankees, who didn't even get to the series that year, Cleveland had just an insane regular season, winning 111 games. And then they were swept by the Giants in the World Series. That was the series where Willie Mays made that famous over-the-shoulder catch in Game 1. But the Yankees, that 54 season, had a winning percentage of .669, which was the best of any team in the Casey Stengel era, including his championship teams, all 7 of them. Actually, that 54 club was better than a number of Yankee championship clubs by season win percentage. And they scored 19 more runs that season than one of my top 5 teams of all time, and had a better cumulative whip, that's walks and hits per innings pitched, than another. That 54 staff was great. They had a great 1 through 5 there with Whitey Ford, Bob Grimm, Johnny Sane, who's one of the possible answers in today's trivia question, Allie Reynolds, who would have been a Hall of Famer if he hadn't had his career cut short. The Yankees had a freak accident where their team bus crashed into an overpass in 1953, and he hurt his back, and his career was basically over after that. And then they also had the junk man, Eddie Lopat. But the 54 club didn't crack the top 5 in any other category. And, spoiler alert here, and I hate to say this for those who grew up in that Stengel era, or the Billy Martin era, which I did, but neither the Stengel nor the Billy Martin era, the best team managed by Billy was that 77 team, and they only had a win percentage of .617, which is 5th lowest among all 27 championship teams. But that Stengel era and the Billy Martin era, neither of them produced any of my top 5 Yankee seasons. Obviously, these were some great, great teams, particularly some of those Casey Stengel teams. But my top 5 were even greater, and I'll explain why as we go. Now, the minute you start comparing teams in the modern era with teams from the age of Ruth and Gehrig, you run into problems, okay? Now some are easily solved. For example, 2 of my top 5 teams played 162 games a season, and the other 3 played 154, and so percentage stats were fine. But cumulative stats, which I used, as I said, but not as much, I just extrapolated the 2 modern teams' cumulative stats, for example, total home runs, total runs scored, total errors, down to a 154-game season. That was easy. But other factors are tougher to deal with. For example, the rise of the bullpen and relief specialists after World War II as compared to the 20s and 30s, when complete games were incredibly common, almost the norm. There were relievers back then, but full-time relievers were definitely the exception, not the rule at that point. And in fact, a team's ace starting pitcher was used in between his starts a lot of the times to close games. And actually, later research showed that Hall of Famer Lefty Grove, who pitched for the A's in the 30s and then the Red Sox later, would have been in his league's top 3 in saves in 4 different seasons. This is a starter. had that stat been invented at the time. Now, other differences between these eras, obviously pitchers used to hit in the American League, which slightly boosts the offensive numbers of teams that use the DH. And as I mentioned, we have multi-tiered playoffs now, and for decades it was just the series, that was it. Now, how I dealt with that was that I just looked at World Series alone. I didn't count any of those playoff series of the later teams. So it just so happens that 4 of my top 5 teams here swept their World Series, no surprise really, and the 5th team won their series in 5. But honestly, I didn't weigh World Series performance that highly. It's just too small a sample size, but I did count it. And my number 3 and 4 teams were really, really close overall. But as we'll see today, one of those 2 teams had a better World Series than the other, and it may have helped nudge them into that 3 spot. We'll see. But I focused more on regular season. And assessing fielding was tricky as well. Now, there certainly are advanced metrics for fielding, like ultimate zone rating. There are others, but they aren't really available for those golden age teams. At least I couldn't find any. So I had to go by fielding percentage and total errors, and those 2 stats, they carry a very strong subjective element. We've all seen errors that should have been hits, and vice versa. But one thing that helped there was that the best fielding team in my top 5 had quite a bit of separation from the other 4. So again, I did count World Series performance, and I certainly counted fielding substantially more than World Series performance, but I didn't weigh those 2 categories as highly as pitching and offense, for which the stats are much more clear and available. Now with pitching, I only analyzed and compared the top 5 starters for each of my 5 teams here because of the radical differences in bullpen usage I discussed earlier. So while this may not seem fair to Mariano Rivera, the greatest closer of all time, hands down, not to count Mariano when comparing pitching staff seems unfair, but it would also be unfair for the older teams to count him, because that closer role just didn't exist back in the day. And if it had, maybe those earlier Yankee clubs would have had their own Rivera. We don't know. Now, there are other issues, differences in the eras, really too numerous to mention. Obviously, the shameful fact that the league was all white prior to 1947, and even after that. It really took a very long time, a ridiculously long time, to fully integrate. And also the exclusion of international players in that earlier era as well. But one way to get around those differences is to compare each team's performance with their peers. In other words, compare them to other teams that had to deal with the same factors, good and bad, quality of competition, travel, diet, media obligations, off-season employment, which is incredibly common back then in the old days, and so on. And so I factored in each team's separation from their peers quite strongly, because that's a telltale sign of a great team. And of course, the final issue is the ongoing debate of which is more important to a team's success, offense or pitching and defense, and which, if either, should I weigh more highly? Tough to answer. There was a study a few years ago which I read that concluded that pitching and defense are slightly more important, but I read a different study, actually more recent, which concluded that the numbers are not overwhelmingly conclusive in favor of either. My personal feeling, and this is based on intuition, I guess, is that pitching and defense are slightly more important. But there certainly have been a number of championship clubs, the 2009 Yankees, for example, that won it all primarily on the strength of their offense, which, on that 2009 team, which was led by A-Rod and Teixeira, the team ERA that year was 4.26, so not great at all. Jabba Chamberlain struggled. Pettit and A.J. Burnett were inconsistent, I would say. And although Pettit was very effective in that World Series, as usual for him, A.J. Burnett less so. In fact, he was pulled in the 3rd inning of that Game 5 loss after giving up 6 runs. But anyway, I ranked hitting and pitching equally, and again, fielding slightly lower for reasons already stated, and postseason performance a lot lower. And as I said at the top, I made some really interesting discoveries. For example, one of my top 5 teams that's remembered for its offense actually had much better pitching than I realized, and not as good total team offense 1 through 9. And that's a good place to start. So without further ado, let's get rolling here with my number 5 team. And that team is your 61 Yankees, the 5th greatest team in franchise history, managed by Ralph Houck. And this is that one team out of my top 5 that lost a World Series game. So my top 5 teams went 20-1 in World Series play. Not bad. But with this 61 club, obviously the first thing everyone thinks of is Maris and the 61 home runs, breaking Babe Ruth's record and all the controversy surrounding that with the asterisk and all the rest. But Mickey Mantle, man, he had a phenomenal 1961, better than Maris. Now, Mantle's best season overall was 1957. He hit 365 that year. Unfortunately, a pretty good hitter named Ted Williams, at the age of 39, hit 388, which is insane. But in 61, despite hitting 7 fewer home runs than Maris, remember, Mantle was hospitalized late in that season with an infected hip from an injection that I guess went awry somehow. But Mantle's OPS that season, on base plus slugging percentage, was 1135. That's the stratosphere, folks. And Mantle's wins above replacement in 1961 was the 3rd highest for any player on my top 5 teams at 10.5, behind only the Ruth and Gehrig of 1927. And look, it's not exactly a spoiler to say that 27 team is in my top 5, but in 61, first baseman Bill Skowron called him Moose. He and Elston Howard hit 28 and 21 home runs respectively. So the one statistical category where this team was number 1 in my top 5 teams was total home runs. That's even after extrapolated down to a shorter season. But that home run barrage in 61 was largely based on the strength of 2 guys, Mantle and Maris. Mantle hit a career-high 54 that year. And some of my other teams in my top 5 just had a deeper lineup. In fact, all of them did. And as great as Mantle and Maris were as a pair that 61 season, Ruth and Gehrig were just better on a number of occasions, despite hitting slightly fewer home runs. And again, this is where we get into separations from their peers, which I counted very highly. So to give you a sense of the magnitude of what Ruth and Gehrig did in 1927, in 1961, the league average among the 19 other teams, that was a weird year. It was an expansion year, and the American League actually had more teams in it than the National League, which was another argument used by the Maris haters. The Roger Maris haters would say that the pitching was watered down that year because of that. But the average team home run total for non-Yankee clubs in 1961 was 131. So yes, the Yankees that year with 240, which by the way, last season we hit one more than that. But yeah, the 61 season, the Yankees hit 97 more than the league average, which is really big. But when you compare that 27 team, who hit 158 that year, to their peers, the league average in 27 by non-Yankee teams was a grand total of, wait for it, 51, okay? Just a bit more separation there, as the 27 Yankees exceeded the league average by 107, as opposed to the 61 club, who exceeded their league average by 97. Still remarkable, but I mean, in 27, Babe Ruth alone hit more home runs that season than 10 out of the other 15 major league teams, okay? And Ruth and Gehrig combined hit more than any other team. So again, that 27 club just soared higher above their competition than the 61 team, and they were much more well-rounded, which shows in team OPS. OPS for the 61 club actually ranks 5th among my top 5 teams because there were dead spots in that lineup. Second baseman Bobby Richardson, third baseman Clete Boyer, both tremendous defensive infielders, but not so hot with the stick. Richardson's on base that year was just 295. It's terrible. Boyer's wasn't much better. Whereas just staying with those 2 infield positions, second and third, second baseman Tony Lazzeri of the 27 Yankees, one of 7 Hall of Famers on that club, and that isn't even the record. Another of my top 5 teams had 9. But Lazzeri had an on-base percentage of 383 and 18 home runs, which doesn't sound like a lot compared to Ruth and Gehrig, but it was a lot then. And third baseman Joe Dugan, probably the weakest hitter in that 27 lineup, past his prime and banged up that year, but his on-base was still 13 points higher than Clete Boyer in 1961, and Dugan was widely considered to be the best defensive third baseman of his era. But before moving on, as I said earlier, what surprised me about this 1961 club was how good their pitching was, especially their top 3. Whitey Ford, Bill Stafford, and Ralph Terry. Ford, in that 61 series against the Reds, set the record with 32 consecutive scoreless innings in World Series play. The record he broke was initially set by Babe Ruth, by the way, from his days with the Red Sox. But that top three of Ford, Stafford, and Terry were really, really good. And I'll give you my top 10 pitching performances from these 5 teams next week. But another name you may not have heard, Luis Arroyo. Arroyo, who was the first Puerto Rican to play for the Yankees, was a tremendous asset in 61 as the relief ace. He pitched 119 innings with a 2.19 ERA, giving up only 5 home runs that season. And that was a season like 98, when home run totals just went through the roof. Moving on to the 4th best Yankee season of all time. Now, as I mentioned, the separation between 3 and 4 wasn't that great. So I'll talk about each of these 2 teams, my 3 and 4 teams, side by side, and then I'll reveal to you which I ranked above the other. And they are 1932 and 1939, which, although they're only 7 years apart, there are more differences than similarities between these 2 teams, as I'll explain. Now, there are players who played on both teams. The Hall of Fame pitchers, Lefty Gomez and Red Ruffing. Ruffing was traded to the Yankees from the Red Sox in 1930, another of Boston's just genius maneuvers, well done. And he was the Yankees' best pitcher in the 30s, really their ace through 46, and Red Ruffing has a plaque in Monument Park. Also playing for both teams was catcher Bill Dickey, another Hall of Famer, and Gehrig's roommate and best friend on the team. But as I said, the 32 and the 39 teams had more differences than similarities. Despite their close proximity in years. 39, of course, was the season that Lou Gehrig took himself out of the lineup after first experiencing symptoms of ALS the previous season, and replacing him at first was Babe Dahlgren. So right there, that's a huge difference already. And Babe Ruth played his last game in 1935, and he was replaced in right field by George Selkirk, another massive difference. I mean, George Selkirk was a good player. He was a 2-time All-Star, actually. But, he was no Babe Ruth. No one was, or ever will be ever again. And another difference is at second base. You had Tony Lazzeri at second in 1932, and Hall of Famer Joe Gordon at second base in 1939. That's less of a disparity, but Lazzeri's 32 was better than Gordon's 39. Joe Gordon was ultimately traded to the Indians in 1946 for Allie Reynolds. Actually, Joe DiMaggio pushed for that trade. He could never catch up to Allie Reynolds' fastball, so he thought it would be a good acquisition, and he was right. Reynolds was great, but Gordon played a very big role on that 1948 championship team in Cleveland, which was their last. But Joe Gordon was a great Yankee. And in center field, you had Hall of Famer Earl Combs in 1932 give way to Joe DiMaggio, who came up in 36. That's a clear advantage for 39, although Combs was great. And left fielder Ben Chapman was succeeded by Charlie Keller in left. Keller wins that head-to-head as well. So you can start to see here how this isn't such an easy call between these 2 teams. This ranking actually gave me the most trouble by far. Same manager, Joe McCarthy, and again, just 7 years apart, but that 32 team was mostly Miller-Huggins holdovers. Huggins died in 29, and after a couple of placeholders there, McCarthy took over in 31. So essentially, on that 32 club, you had McCarthy managing a Huggins group. And that 32 team, by the way, that's the team that I mentioned before that had 9 Hall of Famers. That's a Major League record. And another piece of trivia, that 32 club is the only Major League team in history to ever go an entire season without being shut out. And they really rivaled that 27 club for sheer pop. I mean, just to give an example, there was a game that season where 2 guys just put on an absolute show for the ages. June 3rd, 1932, against the Philadelphia Athletics, Gehrig hit 4 home runs, first time ever in the majors. And in the 9th inning, he came within inches of hitting a 5th. That's never been done. But that isn't even the whole story. Overshadowed by Gehrig was Tony Lazzeri, who not only hit for the cycle, but it was a natural cycle. So that's a very rare thing. Natural cycle is when a player hits a single, double, triple, and home run in that order. It's only happened 13 times in Major League history. There's been more perfect games than there were natural cycles. And by the way, that home run Lazzeri hit in that cycle was a grand slam, okay? So you had a guy with a skill set of a Tony Lazzeri overshadowed by Gehrig during that era, and then you had Gehrig overshadowed by Ruth, which to some extent was based on personality differences. But they had a falling out around that time and didn't speak for years. The details of that I'll get into on our next episode when I interviewed Jonathan Eig, who wrote Luckiest Man, which is a phenomenal biography of Lou Gehrig. But Lazzeri had the last laugh on both of them. I found this quote from Tony Lazzeri, asked later in life about this friction between Ruth and Gehrig. He said, "Yeah, they didn't get along. Gehrig thought Ruth was a big mouth, and Ruth thought Gehrig was cheap. They were both right." And by the way, Lazzeri actually had epilepsy, and a lot of teams passed on him for that reason. I guess they were afraid he would have a seizure during a game or just injure himself during a seizure. But the Yankees signed him in 1925, and you read a lot about stories like that of teams passing on future Hall of Famers for odd reasons. John McGraw of the New York Giants, one of the great all-time managers, passed on Lou Gehrig. Gehrig tried out for McGraw when he was 18 years old. Gehrig was already a legend in New York. Best player produced by New York City public schools before or since, and he hit well for McGraw, but then he mishandled a couple of grounders at first, and McGraw passed. So, that changed the course of baseball history. But that 1932 lineup put the absolute fear of God into opposing pitchers, and their offensive performance in the 32 World Series, that was the one where Babe Ruth may or may not have called his shot against the Cubs at Wrigley Field. But that 32 series is the most dominant World Series performance by any of my top 5 teams. Check this out. They scored 37 runs in just 4 games, okay? So if that was a prize fight, it would have been called like a TKO in the first. But again, by 39, you had a substantially different group. More in the mold of McCarthy himself, very serious man, disciplinarian, which Gehrig actually took to very well. He was very much the good soldier. And so this became Gehrig's team, whereas the Huggins group really reflected Babe Ruth's personality, much more swagger on that team. They played hard in every sense of the word, with the exception of Gehrig, who was always a loner. But even without Ruth and Gehrig, that 39 team was an offensive powerhouse as well. And Joe DiMaggio's 39 made my top 10 list, which I'll get into next week for greatest individual performances from these 5 seasons. He came in at number 5 on that list. And the 39 team was just a machine. I mean, they swept the Reds in the World Series, and this marked the first time any team in the majors had won 4 consecutive World Series. Now, the 39 club had a better winning percentage than the 32 team, just barely. The 32 team had .695, and the 39 club was .702. Only other Yankee teams to crack that 700 barrier were the 27 and 98 teams. But really, the most famous event of that 39 season, it wasn't even a game. It was the ceremony on July 4th, Lou Gehrig Day, where he delivered one of the most touching and really profound speeches of all time. Considering the circumstances. So this is really a changing of the guard in 39. A DiMaggio, who was, of course, spectacular in the 3 seasons he played with Gehrig. In fact, his 37 was every bit as good as Gehrig's. And in 38, he was significantly better, but that was the year that Gehrig got sick. But in 39, DiMaggio was really the guy, which wasn't really as radical a transition as the one from Ruth to Gehrig. DiMaggio actually shared many of the same stoic sort of qualities as Gehrig, but a little more elegance, a little more style and charisma. And that was reflected, by the way, in the media attention he received. He got a lot more media from his rookie year on, really, than Gehrig ever did as a player. But DiMaggio in 39 was an absolute force to be reckoned with. It was a season for the ages, really. Slightly better than Gehrig's 32 season, 8.1 wins above replacement for DiMaggio in 39, compared to 7.9 for Gehrig in 32. DiMaggio's on base was 448. That's just beyond ridiculous. 126 RBIs, just a monster year, one of many for the Yankee Clipper. Actually, just looking at the numbers, probably the best season of his career, even better than the streak year of 41. Let's see here. Yeah, here, 1941, DiMaggio hit 357, and in 39, he hit 381. Okay, man, oh man. You look at these stats for these guys, and, you think that can't be right. Somebody goofed, but, they really were that good. And other standout hitters on that 39 team as well. Left fielder Charlie Keller, who I mentioned, hit 334 that year. Third baseman Red Rolfe, who later managed the Tigers, actually. Not a Hall of Famer, but a key member of that 39 team. He hit 329 that year with 213 hits and 80 RBI. So that 39 team was great offensively as well. just maybe a slight cut below the 32 team, because in 39 you had DiMaggio. DiMaggio was a beast, but in 32, you had two beasts in Ruth and Gehrig, and Ruth had a better 32 than DiMaggio's 39. Not by much, actually, but just a bit better. And of course, Babe Dahlgren in 39 wasn't even a shadow of Gehrig's 32. I mean, I don't want to insult the memory of Babe Dahlgren here, who was a decent player, better than average fielder, but only hit .235 in 39. So I won't do a side-by-side between Dahlgren and Gehrig. That would be like comparing like the Da Vinci Code to War and Peace. You just don't do it. Because Gehrig's 32, 151 RBIs, that led the team. And just to give you a sense of it, Aaron Judge, who hit 52 home runs last year, as compared to Gehrig, who in 32, who hit 34 home runs, Judge had 115 RBIs, so 36 fewer. Gehrig was an absolute RBI machine throughout his entire career. He actually had more RBIs than Babe Ruth in 27 and 32, despite hitting behind him in the order. Batting average in 32 was .349. On base over 100 points higher than that. So a player's on base percentage is normally about 60 points or so higher than his batting average. But pitchers were obviously walking Gehrig on a regular basis just to get to left fielder Ben Chapman, who was no slouch. But certainly all those walks, over 100 that year, boosted Gehrig's on-base percentage and the team's success. Now, pitching between these two clubs, 32 and 39, it's really a toss-up. The best pitcher on both teams was the same guy, Red Ruffing, and his 32 was the single best pitching performance from any of these top 5 championship seasons, with a wins above replacement of 6.5, 18-game winner, 190 strikeouts. Lefty Gomez also great on both clubs. His 39 was actually slightly better than his 32. Now, the place where the 32 staff maybe had a slight edge was the back end of that rotation, but honestly, neither of these teams had very good 4 and 5 starters. A couple of names on the 39 club I'd actually never even heard of, Atlee Donald and Monty Pearson. So look, as I've been saying, this was a really tough call. But given the fact that the 32 team had a marginally better offense with not one beast but two, given the fact that the pitching was more or less a wash, throw in a more dominating World Series performance by the 32 club, they scored more runs, 1,002 to 967. I gave it to 32, but it was a squeaker, man. I mean, if there's a 39 guy out there, you could probably sit me down and give me a good argument, the crux of which I imagine might be that they had a better win percentage. But I would counter that the quality of competition was greater in 32. They had to deal with the Philadelphia A's, who were just a powerhouse then. They had Hall of Famers Jimmy Fox, Double X, and Lefty Grove at their absolute peak. That Philly club won 2 World Series in the early 30s. It's too bad that Philadelphia doesn't have an American League club anymore. That would be a lot of fun to go down there and kind of battle it out. But anyway, 1932 is my final verdict for the third greatest team in franchise history. So again, for those keeping score at home, I've got 1961 as the 5th greatest team of all time, 1939 in the 4 spot, 1932 in the 3 spot, and obviously the Yankees had plenty of other great seasons in the late 20s and 30s. As a matter of fact, from 27 through 39, the Yankees won 7 out of 13 championships. And in series play during that stretch, they won 28 games and lost 3. So, when people call this the greatest franchise in the history of sports, they're not just blowing smoke. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers trivia. Which of these former Yankees was the first pitching coach for the New York Mets in 1962? Was it A, Joe Page, B, Red Ruffing, C, Vic Rashi, or D, Johnny Sain? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
All right, back here on Bronx Bombers, and our featured guest once again is EJ Fagan, who covers the Yankees on his podcast, Bronx Beat. EJ is here with us for part 2 of our conversation, which we begin with a question about Gary Sanchez. Now with Sanchez, EJ, how much does the pitch blocking, the pass balls bother you? And it's not really just that. He's had problems handling throws on plays at the plate, twice that I can think of in the Houston series alone. So is this a major cause for concern, or do you think it's overblown, given how young he is and how much he gives us with the bat?
I think it's overblown. We have statistics for this, right? We have good defensive statistics on things like passed balls. We don't have great defensive statistics on catchers in general. So we know a lot about throwing out runners. We know a lot about holding runners to bases. We know a lot about passed balls. We now know a lot about framing. We don't know a lot about like the psychology and that kind of stuff of a catcher. But everything but the pass balls is really good. And we can put a number on how much the pass balls cost this team. And it doesn't cost this team very much. I think it became a meme. I think this might be a little bit of why Joe Girardi got fired, that people just started to say that Gary Sanchez isn't a good catcher because the most visible thing when the camera is directly on him, you see him fail. Right? If he was like an average pass baller and a below average to bad thrower, I think that even that little bit of a difference, people would not be so hard on Gary Sanchez because his face wouldn't be on camera when he screws up. And I think that's really what this is about, is that people are drawn to the visible and ignore the invisible. Gary Sanchez is an above average defensive catcher by every number we have. I have no reason to doubt that. The Yankee pitching staff was excellent last year with him catching. I think Gary Sanchez is. I have many more problems with Austin Romine than I do with Gary Sanchez.
Okay, starting pitching. At this point, we're looking at Severino, Tanaka, Sonny Gray, Sabathia, and Montgomery. But there's also been some trade chatter. Patrick Corbin of the Diamondbacks, Michael Fulmer, and Darvish, which I don't really see happening. But EJ, are we pretty well set up with those 5 starters I just listed? Or do you think we need an upgrade? And do you think if we make a trade or sign a free agent pitcher, that a 6-man rotation is a possibility?
I think they should. I think some major league team at some point is going to do a 6-man rotation well. The Dodgers essentially had a 6-man rotation last year. They kind of used the disabled list as their 6th man and shuffled pitchers around that way. In the age of arm injuries, I just read Jeff Passan's book, The Arm, which we're going to be talking about on the podcast in the next couple of weeks. And the argument that Passan makes in there is essentially that pitchers should throw less. Pitchers throw too much. They throw too much at a young age. They throw too much often in the major leagues. And when they throw less, they get injured less. And I like Luis Severino. I want Luis Severino to be an ace for the Yankees for the next decade. I don't want him to go down with Tommy John surgery. I don't want Masahiro Tanaka to go down with Tommy John surgery with half a UCL. And I want an old guy like CC Sabathia to continue to be effective. Giving them more rest should do that. I think the Yankees are well positioned to go to a 6-man rotation, in part because, as you said, they're considering signing new players. I'm not too sure about you, Darvish. And they have 5 really good starting pitchers at AAA right now. Good enough that they let a guy like Nestor Cortez go in the Rule 5 draft, and Nestor Cortez is probably a starter on 10 teams in the league right now. That's how deep this team is. They can go to 6-man easy.
Okay, so looking at our farm system, everybody knows Gleyber Torres is our number 1 prospect, but who are the 2 or 3 guys right behind Gleyber? And are any of them, whether it's outfielder Estevan Florial, Justice Sheffield, who pitched very well in the Arizona Fall League a few months ago, third baseman Miguel Andujar, Chance Adams, hard-throwing righty, do any of our prospects, other than Gleyber Torres, have big league potential in 2018? Give us some quick takes on some of our top prospects.
Yeah, I think all the guys you mentioned besides Estevan Florial have potential next year. They're at triple or double A. They are very talented and have had recent success and are young. Right, those are all good things for prospects. I think that the real special part about this Yankee system is the teens. It's fascinating. I always love reading little offhand comments from all the kind of the neutral prospect people at Baseball America and Baseball Prospectus and those kinds of places about farm systems. And they do not know what to say about the Yankee farm system right now. John Sickles, who's at minor league ball, said that he had to rank, or he had to list 82 different legitimate Yankee prospects in the minor leagues when he was considering which prospects would be in his top 20. And the Yankees had something like 35 what he calls C or better prospects, so pretty good prospects. There are teams like the Marlins who have 5 C or better prospects. The Yankees are incredibly deep. They are so deep that they are not going to be able to deal with all of these players coming up to the major leagues and finding roster spots for them. They already don't have roster spots at their AAA rotation. They already had to trade about 10 guys at the trade deadline, or else they would have been killed at the Rule 5 draft this year and really would have had to make some tough decisions on their 40-man roster. And even so, even despite all that massive trade, they had to trade like 4 guys right before the Rule 5 draft, basically for peanuts, just to make sure they didn't lose them. It is a incredibly deep farm system. It will pay dividends, and this is why I've been advocating for the Yankees being very aggressive, trading prospects for current major league players right now. Because eventually the Jorge Guzmans of the world, we're not going to have a spot for them.
Now, we all sing Brian Cashman's praises, and rightfully so. I don't think he gets enough credit, actually, because he has money to spend. But one of the few bad deals he made is the Jacoby Ellsbury contract, which, I mean, you could make the argument that this ranks with some of the worst free agent signings in franchise history. Not just the money, but the years. And let's face it, despite all of our recent good fortune, we're dealing with the repercussions of that deal now, as Ellsbury, whose time with the Yankees I would characterize as totally unremarkable. Ellsbury seems to be a man without a role on this team, now with our glut of quality outfielders, and if he's true to his word, or maybe I should say true to his agent's word, he will not waive his no-trade clause. So are the Yankees up a creek here, EJ? I mean, is Jacoby Ellsbury destined to be the highest-paid pinch runner in the history of baseball, or do we have options here that I'm not considering?
Yeah, a 34-year-old or 33-year-old pinch runner doesn't sound great to me.
No, it sounds terrible.
Look, I think he's a good but not good enough player is the problem. I think Jacoby Ellsbury a year ago, if you told me that he was going to be essentially a 2-win player or a 1.5-win player in 2018, I would have said, okay, that player's probably starting on the Yankees, even if it's not that great. But then Aaron Hicks was otherworldly. Aaron Hicks was better than I think people realize when in his essentially half season, and then Aaron Judge and now Giancarlo Stanton and all of these players have made him essentially useless on this roster. I think the Yankees should consider releasing him if he isn't going to move his no trade clause or waive his no trade clause. The problem with that is I think that Jacoby Ellsbury, I think there's a sunk cost problem. Fallacy going on here, where the Yankees say, well, we're paying him a whole lot of money, I guess we're going to have to keep him on the roster, when he's just not that useful. He's a good runner, but he's not a great runner. There are better pinch runners out there that you could get and have on this roster that are better defensive players and better runners and maybe even better hitters that are not Jacoby Ellsbury. And Clint Frazier is blocked by Jacoby Ellsbury. Now, I'm not that big of a Clint Frazier fan, but if he's still on this roster come spring training and he has a really good start to the season and Jacoby Ellsbury is on the Major League roster, I think you got to play him, which means you have no spot with a 4-man bench for Jacoby Ellsbury. So at some point, if he doesn't want to waive his no-trade clause, I think that's your next option. I don't believe they can outright him to the minors, but if they could outright him to the minors, that's what I would do. And I would say, look, we can trade you to a team, and we will take all but $5 million of his salary, and some team will be happy to have you and start you every day, or you can play at AAA. If that's an option, and I'm not too sure if it is given the rules, that's my course of action right now. He is a superfluous piece in this roster, and it's a sad thing because he's still not that bad of a player. He's not Albert Pujols. He's a valuable, above replacement level Major League Baseball player. He's just paid too much.
So you talked on your podcast recently about how second base plays out, and I think we agree that the Yankees most likely start the season with Ronald Torreyes at second, with Tyler Wade as a backup, and that'll leave Gleyber Torres in AAA for a month, so the Yankees can take advantage of that service time loophole and hang on to him for an extra year before free agency. But in May, he'll almost certainly be our second baseman, unless he just has a terrible spring training, which I don't anticipate. Is that pretty much the deal at second base?
I think trades could happen. The Yankees, Torreyes is a fine replacement player. He was probably a little better last year than his actual talent. I think there's no reason that he should be on the Major League roster, even as a backup infielder. If I'm the Yankees, I trade for somebody whose long-term role on this team is utility player. Better utility player than Ronald Torreyes. Maybe a guy who would even start for a lot of teams, but to be on a world championship team, he'd be willing to be a utility player. Houston has a guy like this in Marwin Gonzalez. Pittsburgh has Josh Harrison, who rumors have the Yankees checking out. And that guy's your temporary second baseman until Gleyber Torres' contract clock reaches 1 day over free agency for that seventh year. And then you call up Gleyber Torres and you turn the other guy into a utility player. But of course, at the same time, you have a hole at third base. So you need to know what's going to happen at third base. And so until those are filled, I don't know how to answer the question. I don't even know if the Yankees know right now how to answer that question. They had an opportunity to get rid of Chase Headley and an opportunity to get rid of Starlin Castro, and they took it, and they said, we'll figure it out later.
Now, third base remains an open question. We've heard about Eduardo Nunez, but a name we haven't heard enough, in my opinion, is Mike Moustakas, who, as a lefty dead pull hitter with power, could do serious damage in Yankee Stadium. And I think the Yankees, with a little fancy footwork, could probably sign him and stay under that luxury tax threshold. But your thoughts on the third base situation, EJ?
I like Mike Moustakas at a price, right? That's really what this question is. And I suspect a lot of teams like Moustakas at a fairly cheap price. The Yankees have a little bit of a problem here that They can't do like a 1-year deal with a higher average annual value than you would get with a multi-year deal. So, you can imagine Mike Moustakas saying, market's not great right now. I'm going to take a 1-year, $25 million deal, like a Cespedes deal, or a deal with a really easy opt-out or something like that after the first year. And you can imagine a lot of teams being interested in that 1-year contract. A lot of contending teams would definitely consider that. And I think the Yankees would benefit from that. The problem is that with their current luxury tax situation, they can't do that. They actually would rather sign somebody to a long-term deal than a short-term kind of inflated contract deal. The problem is that I don't want Mike Moustakas for a bunch of years. Mike Moustakas is a perfectly serviceable baseball player who's likely to get overpaid, I think, this offseason because he hit 38 home runs last year. He hit 38 home runs, and I think he was like a 2.5-win player because he didn't put up great defensive numbers. He put up like okay defensive numbers, and he had like a 320 on base percentage. I want Manny Machado at that spot long term, and I'm willing to wait a season to get it. I don't know how much of an upgrade Moustakas is over someone like Miguel Andujar. So if it's a 1-year, $20 million deal and you can fit it under the luxury tax threshold, it's not my money, let's do it. I'll break that home run record, let's do it. But if it's a 5-year deal worth $120 million, I do not do that.
All right, final question. As I've told our podcast audience, I find the Yankees right now, just looking at it analytically and not even as a fan, I find them to be one of the most fascinating teams to try and size up this preseason, just because of how explosive this lineup can potentially be. I mean, I tweeted this at one point. This lineup, at least on paper, it's really historic potentially in terms of power numbers. But then when you throw in a full season of Tommy Kahnle, David Robertson, and Sonny Gray, throw in what I think will be a bounce-back year for Tanaka and Greg Bird, throw in Chad Green, coming off a phenomenal rookie year, solid rotation 1 through 5, Gleyber Torres knocking at the door. As you look around at the other 29 teams, EJ, what are your thoughts as far as the championship potential of this team now just 1 week from spring training?
I think the Yankees have to be one of the favorites. I think the Yankees by run differential last year were a 100-win team. They were as good as essentially everybody but the Dodgers and the Astros last year. And the Astros had a really good year last year, and they're going to be a contender this coming year. Other than them, I don't think there's any really strong teams in the American League. I think Cleveland is probably due to come down a little bit. I think that there's probably some overdue regression in their pitching staff, and I think their lineup is a little bit overrated. I think the Red Sox have more holes than people realize, especially in their starting rotation. And I think the Yankees basically don't have any weaknesses. I mean, you can make a case that the Yankees have the best rotation, the best lineup, and the best bullpen in the American League. That's nuts. And they're deep, and they have a massive farm system, and they can trade for players if they need to, and might have a little bit of payroll room and might still be adding players. And if I'm betting, I think I'm betting on the Yankees, though, I still take the field over any team. Other teams could certainly win it, but the Yankees are in a pretty darn good spot right now.
All right, well done, EJ. It's been a pleasure having you with us. You do great work. Love your podcast. That's the Bronx Beat Podcast, which all of you guys should go check out and subscribe to. I want to thank EJ for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And we'll be back with more on the Bronx Bombers podcast here in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which former Yankee was the first pitching coach for the Mets in 1962? The answer? B. Red Ruffing. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. What do you think of Major League Baseball's idea of introducing a 20-second pitch clock? Now, before I get to the results here, it seems unlikely that a pitch clock will be used this season. The Players Association has rejected the idea, and Commissioner Rob Manfred's latest proposal to the players last week removed the pitch clock from the equation entirely, as long as the players accept other regulations that would reduce the length of games. So one of these other regulations would be that hitters would have to remain in the batter's box at all times. And another is that pitchers would have to be ready immediately once the between-inning commercial break is over. And then one last one here, a limit of 6 total mound visits per game. And that covers the manager, pitching coach, and the catcher, really any player. So Manfred's goal here is to reduce the average game time to 2 hours and 55 minutes. And he said last week that if that goal was achieved, the pitch clock would not be implemented in 2019. But then he sort of moved the marker, and he said it also wouldn't be used in 2020 if the games in 2019 averaged 2 hours and 50 minutes, not 55, okay? And this is precisely my concern here, the slippery slope element. But just to finish the facts here, the players haven't responded to this latest proposal, which again does not include a 20-second pitch clock, but I do see the pitch clock entering the game eventually. And before I reveal the results here of our poll, let me just tell you what a pitch clock is for those who may not know. And this has already been used, by the way, in the minors here and there since 2014. So with a pitch clock, pitchers must begin their motion within 20 seconds of the previous pitch. A pitcher receives a warning for his first violation and then a ball for every subsequent violation. And by the way, the pitch clock, at least according to Manfred's initial proposal, would only be used with the bases empty. Although again, to repeat my slippery slope concerns, if the pitch clock enters the game in any form, I'm sure it would eventually be used in all situations because the big step is getting it in. Once it's in, to increase its usage won't be hard. But we asked you for your take on the pitch clock. 35% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said, I'll wait and see. 31% said they liked it, 19% said they dislike it, and 15% said they hate it. Now, I'll be honest, my initial reaction to this was that I hated it. I think one of the unique and beautiful aspects of baseball is the absence of a clock. But to be fair, this isn't a game clock, okay? This is a clock designed to limit the amount of time in which nothing happens of interest. I mean, pitchers taking forever to throw a pitch, Sonny Gray is notorious for this, batters stepping out, mound visits. These are not things we tune in to see. Now, a counter argument against the clock might be that the pitch clock, when used, has shaved only about 10 minutes off the game. Is that 10 minutes going to bring in new fans? Probably not. Will that 10 minutes keep fans who are fed up with the length of baseball games from switching to something else? Probably not. But obviously, these games are just too damn long. A lot of these games are on weeknights. And, people have to get up in the morning and go to work. So this doesn't affect me as much. I'm a musician, so I have nighttime hours. And since I watch most of these games after the fact, and I can use that 10-second fast-forward feature on the Apple TV remote if I'm bored during mound visits and things like that, I'm good. But I understand that fans on a normal schedule can be frustrated by constantly having to miss the ends of games. So even though I'm a traditionalist in general, I think the goal of cutting these games to 2 hours and 55 minutes is reasonable. And I'm going to put myself in the wait and see column. But again, my concern in this age of lightning speed communication, where everyone's all about instant gratification and, attention spans are dropping into the negative integers. My concern is that in a misguided effort to fit the game into that hyperkinetic mindset, that these initial measures won't be the end, but rather the beginning, and that in a few years, we'll be looking at a different game altogether. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Sal in East Orange, New Jersey. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can look us up on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle, or on our Facebook page. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Sal writes, I like what you said about Chad Green. He's the best Yankee no one's talking about, but I feel like he's being wasted in middle relief. Why not give him a shot in the starting rotation? Okay, so before I answer Sal's question, which is an excellent question, I'd like to take this opportunity here and now to praise Chad Green and his explosive fastball to the skies. I was going to do a whole main thing segment on this, but I'll do it right here because Green's rookie season, it wasn't just remarkable. It was a truly dominating season. Chad Green was absolutely our best reliever with a 2.7 wins above replacement. There is zero doubt in my mind he had an all-star caliber season, and I'll list 5 relievers right here who made the All-Star team last year. And by the way, a lot of times players are chosen for the All-Star game for stupid reasons, like, the season they had the previous year. Betances is a prime example of that. But Chad Green had a better season statistically than All-Star Chris Davinsky of the Astros. He had a better season than All-Star Brandon Kintzler of the Twins. Actually, Kintzler is now on the Nationals. He was traded midseason, where in 2 months he pitched to a 3.46 ERA. Chad Green's ERA in 2017 was 1.83. And by the way, 13.4 strikeouts per 9 innings over the course of the season. And in the postseason, where he pitched 6.1 innings, his ERA was 0. That is, capital Z-RO. But getting back to the All-Stars, Green had a much better year than Betances, obviously. He had a better season than All-Star Robert Osuna of the Blue Jays. He was better than All-Star Wade Davis of the Cubs. And he was at the very least on a par with All-Star Brad Hand, closer for the Padres. Now, Sal, I do think there's a kind of strange tendency among fans fans to somehow view a pitcher as being quote-unquote wasted in middle relief, like it's some kind of a purgatory, when it's actually a hugely important role. And those guys, those middle relievers, they usually pitch more innings than closers. Let's see. Yeah, Chad Green last season, even though he was handled with kid gloves by the Yankees, pitched 19 more innings than Chapman. And look, don't you want your best relief pitcher pitching the most innings? And besides, we already have 5 starters, and they're all good. And given the fact that Sabathia is getting old and that we don't really know if Tanaka's inconsistency last season was an anomaly or not, I just really like having a Chad Green there to take care of business should one of those guys falter. And it also keeps Canely and Robertson fresh as well as the season wears on. And let's not forget, Sal, the Jabba Chamberlain fiasco of 2008. You can't force someone to become a starter if they're better as a reliever, and Jabba was clearly born to be a reliever. He wasn't nearly as effective as a starter. And also, by August of that year, he was on the DL with a rotator cuff injury. Now, I do believe, given how carefully pitchers are handled these days, and with this epidemic of Tommy John surgeries, that in the years to come, we will see 6-man rotations. But even if Cashman decides to go 6-man, I'd still keep Green in the bullpen. And one final note on Green, he was used as both a starter and a reliever in 2016. Remember, he pitched 45 innings for the Yankees that year, just beneath that threshold of 50 innings, which would have qualified 2016 as his rookie year. And the numbers may be instructive. As a starter, he allowed 24 earned runs in 36.1 innings for a 5.94 ERA. And in 4 games as a reliever, he pitched 9.1 shutout innings. So there it is. But that's a great question, Sal. This is actually a question I've seen debated on various sites and message boards for a while now. So I'm happy not only to give my opinion on it here, but to give Chad Green the praise that he really deserves. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, subscribe via iTunes or Stitcher, rate and review this podcast, follow us on Twitter at Bombers Podcast is the handle, like us on Facebook as well, and most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.